nervous system, and remember the autonomic nervous system is the system that controls involuntary processes as opposed to controlling skeletal muscle contractions. And remember we talked about in terms of the location of some of these neurons. Now some of the neurons do come out through cranial nerves, but those that come out of the spinal column and through the spinal nerves, those are shown here in green. And these are getting stimulation from upper motor neurons coming down from the brain and crossing over at some point and stimulating these neurons. But these are multipolar neurons, lots of dendrites here on the cell body. They are located, the cell body itself of the neuron, of the motor neuron, is located in the lateral gray horn as opposed to the anterior gray horn like you would see with the somatic motor neurons. And the axon exits out to the anterior nerve root into the spinal nerve. So notice that in terms of the green, it's going to be going to cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or glands. Okay, those are what are the effectors in the, let's see, is this going to work? Is it on? Yeah. I don't know if I'm lined up here. I don't have the right spot, just a second. I have to click on this. Okay. And you can see here in this picture that we talked about previously last week when we looked at the spinal cord, the red neuron is a somatic motor neuron, and notice how its axon goes out in the nerve out to the effector, which is skeletal muscle. There's just one motor neuron in the somatic system, just one neuron running all the way to the effector, which would be the skeletal muscle that's innervated for contraction. This would be voluntary contraction. On the other hand, the autonomic motor neuron, here it is in the lateral gray horn, the axon running out through the anterior nerve root. But this neuron is going to synapse with a second neuron called a postganglionic neuron. So the first neuron in the sequence is preganglionic. The second neuron that it synapses with is postganglionic. The synapse is symbolized here between, this would be the axon terminals or synaptic end bulbs, and the dendrites and cell body of this neuron. Again, these are multipolar neurons we're talking about. It's called preganglionic and postganglionic, meaning you're sending signals to the ganglion. A ganglion is where you have synapses. You have synapses with the cell body. So there's a bunch of cell bodies here that creates this little swollen area in the nerve, which we call a ganglion. Remember, there's a ganglion here. The posterior root ganglion and the posterior nerve root. That's an example of a ganglion. This is also a ganglion. So there's a ganglion outside the nervous system where you have the synapse between the preganglionic and postganglionic neuron. Preganglionic sends a signal to the ganglion. Postganglionic carries the signal away to the effector organs, which could be either cardiac muscle or smooth muscle. So they're showing a urinary bladder, but it could be other smooth muscle. It could be in blood vessels as well as other organs in the body. Or it could be going to some kind of gland, like a salivary gland, and in some cases some endocrine glands, but various glands in the body, sweat glands, and salivary glands, digestive glands, and so forth. So it's not going to go, one neuron is not going to serve 3 different tissues though. It's going to do, each ganglion is going to go to a specific type of tissue in the body. They're just showing you the possibilities that it would go to. So these are the possible effectors in the autonomic system. Any questions about that so far? Okay. So, let me see if there's, okay, that's just basically telling you what I just told you. So let's move on to, that's what we already told you. So we'll look at this picture. Now, this is a comparison of the somatic neurons versus autonomic, but also showing sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. And there's a lot going on in this picture. We're going to break it down as we go along. But here is the somatic motor neuron right here. There's the cell body and dendrites, there's the axon, and here you can see it going all the way to the effector, which is skeletal muscle of some type. Notice that, again, one neuron in the pathway. The axon is myelinated. So one of the things about the somatic system is the entire axon is myelinated, and this results in, I think I have the picture here, faster neuron transmission or nerve impulse transmission. So this is a picture from back in the nervous tissue chapter, and it's showing a comparison between unmyelinated and myelinated axons. I'm going to go back to that previous picture in a minute. But unmyelinated axons, when the action potential begins at the beginning of the axon, which in this case would be right here, this is the trigger zone, this is, it's showing here this inflow of sodium. Remember that at the beginning of an action potential, you have an inflow of sodium, which causes the millivoltage to rise up to 30 millivolts from negative 55 to 30. And that's the inflow of sodium. And then those sodium gates close, and then you have an outflow of potassium. As those potassium gates open, you have an outflow of potassium, and the millivolts go back down to negative 70. They're not showing you the potassium flow, they're just showing you the sodium. But here it's showing sodium gates open and sodium flowing in, which is going to depolarize the membrane next door. Right next door, that membrane is going to get depolarized to threshold, which is going to open up sodium gates there, which causes an action potential to happen because you're going to reach threshold. So sodium gates open here, and that's going to also affect the voltage of the membrane next door, so that sodium gates open and sodium flows in there. So now, again, they don't show you the potassium gates, but the potassium gates are going to open as well, and potassium will flow out. So you have sodium in and potassium out. So you're getting like a wave of action potentials all the way down to the synaptic end bulbs. Sodium flowing in, potassium flowing out in a wave, all the way down to the synaptic end bulbs. And then once that action potential arrives there, that's going to stimulate the release of some kind of neurotransmitter. Now, in an unmyelinated axon, this is going to happen sequentially all the way down the line. We call that continuous conduction of a nerve impulse. Continuous conduction, because it's just happening continuously in a wave all the way down the axon. Now, and that's pretty fast. We're talking millivolts. They're showing here 1 millivolt after the action potential begins, 5 milliseconds. I don't know if we're doing millivolts. Milliseconds, 5 milliseconds, and 10 milliseconds after the action potential begins at the beginning of the axon. Milliseconds, we're talking 1,000th of a second. So we're talking very fast transmission. And that continuous conduction. In an unmyelinated axon, here you have an action potential here. That sodium that flows in, what they're showing you here is that sodium that flows in travels down to the next unmyelinated section called the node of Ranvier. If you look at the structure of an axon, between the myelin sheaths here, you have nodes of Ranvier that are exposed. And at those places, the sodium and potassium gates are exposed. So when the sodium flows in here, the sodium diffuses down and brings this region of the membrane and the node of Ranvier to threshold, so that those sodium gates will open and cause an action potential. And then that sodium that flows in here is going to propagate an action potential here. And so sodium will flow in here, and then it'll go to the next node and depolarize the membrane here. So each action potential depolarizes the next node to threshold, generating action potentials all the way down. We call that propagation, when one action potential propagates another action potential. Instead of doing it continuously all the way down the axon, it's doing it only at the nodes, which is much faster. It's like the action potential is sort of jumping from node to node. And by doing so, it's faster transmission down to the end here until you get to this unmyelinated part here, but it's faster transmission wherever it's myelinated. This is called saltatory conduction. It's a very fast way of transmitting impulses. That's why you have a myelin sheath for fast impulse transmission as well as protecting the axon. Notice that at 10 milliseconds in a continuous conduction and unmyelinated axons, there's your action potential versus here, it's much further down. So this is going to be faster nerve impulse transmission when you have myelinated axons. So if you go back to this, in the somatic nervous system, since the motor neurons are all myelinated, they have very fast nerve impulse transmission from the spinal cord to the effector, which is the muscle. Now, of course, they're not showing you cranial nerves. There are some cranial nerves that control skeletal muscle as well. But those neurons and those cranial nerves are also myelinated. So any somatic motor neuron is going to be myelinated. Therefore, it's going to be doing saltatory conduction. Therefore, it's going to have faster impulse transmission. However, if you look at the autonomic system, this is sympathetic. This is a specialized sympathetic system here, and then here's parasympathetic. Notice that the preganglionic neurons are myelinated, but the postganglionic neurons are not. Postganglionic neurons are not. So here they show a myelin sheath, your Schwann cells wrapped around the axon. The dashed line represents unmyelinated axon. So you've got saltatory conduction here, impulses jumping from node to node, therefore faster here, but a little slower here, which means that impulse transmission is a little slower in the autonomic system. That also means that reflexes are a little slower, comparatively speaking, in the autonomic versus somatic system. So like when you pull your hand away from a hot stove, that impulse is faster than internal reflexes that are autonomic. However, that being said, they're still happening within milliseconds. It's just a little bit slower though because of that, okay? So that's one thing to notice about the two systems. Another thing to notice is you've got a couple of different neurotransmitters we're going to be talking about. The two neurotransmitters in the two systems are acetylcholine and norepinephrine, which is abbreviated NE, norepinephrine. Acetylcholine is abbreviated ACH. Notice that somatic motor neurons always release acetylcholine, and acetylcholine always causes skeletal muscle to contract. That's what it does in the somatic system. In the autonomic system, you also have acetylcholine, but it can have varying effects depending on the situation. Notice that you have acetylcholine released here by the preganglionic neuron in the sympathetic division. There's more acetylcholine here in this preganglionic neuron. It's releasing acetylcholine here in the adrenal gland, which stimulates the release of the hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine. We'll come back to that in a minute. And then in the parasympathetic division, you've got acetylcholine being released by preganglionic neurons. So there's a lot of acetylcholine being produced. And there's also acetylcholine being produced by the postganglionic neuron in the parasympathetic division, okay? And that's going to bring on parasympathetic activities there. And we're going to come back to those, the differences between sympathetic and parasympathetic in a minute. But then here you have norepinephrine here. Norepinephrine is being released by the postganglionic neurons in the sympathetic division, and that's going to bring on sympathetic activities. Now, I think I've talked about this, but I'm going to back up for a moment and come back to this. But anyway, so you do have two different neurotransmitters. I do want to point out, notice that you have norepinephrine as a neurotransmitter here. You also have norepinephrine acting as a hormone here. The adrenal glands release, when they're stimulated by the sympathetic division, by this preganglionic neuron, they produce in response two hormones. Epinephrine, which we commonly call adrenaline, that's what people most commonly know it as, and the adrenal response, it's basically the fight or flight response, which the sympathetic division is responsible for, and norepinephrine, which also brings on the same fight or flight response. And And so the adrenal glands are releasing two hormones, norepinephrine and epinephrine, which bring on the sympathetic reactions of speeding up heart rate, increasing respiratory rate, suppressing digestion, things like that. So you've got norepinephrine acting as a hormone here and acting as a neurotransmitter here. So a lot of times you'll see overlap of function between the nervous system and the endocrine system. There's a lot of overlap of function. This is an example of that. We're going to come back to norepinephrine in the sympathetic system in just a minute. But I also want to point out one other thing that might be a little confusing. Notice there's a preganglionic neuron that goes to the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland is a gland that sits on top of your kidneys. It's a gland that sits like a little cap on top of your kidneys. And it's got two regions, the adrenal cortex, which produces its own group of hormones, steroid hormones, come from the adrenal cortex. And then the adrenal medulla is the middle region. Cortex is always the outer region, like the brain, the outer layer of the cerebrum is the cerebral cortex. So the cortex is always the outer region of an organ. The medulla is always the middle region. Just think medulla is the middle. Medulla is the middle region. It's in that pink middle region here where this is happening. So the preganglionic sympathetic neuron stimulates the adrenal medulla specifically to produce these two hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine, which bring on the sympathetic, or the fight or flight response. There's no postganglionic neuron. There's just a preganglionic neuron. So it's a little different. You have one neuron stimulating that. So when your sympathetic division kicks in, not only do you have the sympathetic nervous system having an effect on your body, but you also have the adrenal glands simultaneously having an effect, but they are stimulated by the sympathetic division. So that fight or flight response, which people often associate with adrenaline, is really brought on by the sympathetic division, because not only is it directly stimulating it, but it's also stimulating the adrenal glands to produce adrenaline. So, when you think of the adrenal response, really it's the response of the sympathetic system and the adrenal glands. I do want to back up for a moment, because I thought I was at a different spot in my notes, so let me back up for a second. We were talking about the two systems. First of all, that you have, as we'll see in a moment, most organs receive innervation from both the parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions, except for skeletal muscle, of course, because that's somatic. But most organs have dual innervation, meaning they're getting both sympathetic and parasympathetic innervation. But they're not getting they're not getting equal amounts of stimulation at the same time because of autonomic tone, and that's what I'm not sure if I talked about. Autonomic tone or activity means there's a balance between these two systems. So when you have parasympathetic activity increasing, we say the tone is increasing, parasympathetic tone is increasing. Well, at the same time, the sympathetic tone is turned down. So when you are digesting a meal and relaxing, which is what the parasympathetic division stimulates, then your parasympathetic tone goes up, meanwhile your sympathetic tone goes down. And if later on in the day you go running or you do some kind of exercise, well, then it's going to be the opposite. Your sympathetic tone goes up while your parasympathetic tone goes down. So you're going to increase your heart rate, you're going to increase your respiratory rate, you're going to decrease digestion during that time. Which is why, if you try to, you don't want to try to run or do some kind of really energetic activity after a meal, because you should be turning up your parasympathetic tone. But if you decide to go for a run or do some kind of really strong activity that really raises your heart rate, you're going to reverse what you should be doing. You're going to be stimulating sympathetic tone, and that's actually going to suppress proper digestion. It might end up giving you cramps or not a heart attack, but cramps or a stomach ache or something like that. So when you exercise, you want to do it a couple hours after you've eaten a meal, so you have given time for your parasympathetic tone to do what it needs to do. All right, so let's go back, and we're going to talk more about those activities of these two systems. Any questions so far about these two systems? We're going to kind of break all this down. a bit more into, looking at these different things. So let's first look at the sympathetic division. Any questions so far? Okay. Now the sympathetic division, its nerves come out primarily, or the preganglionic neurons exit primarily from the spinal cord. So where you're going to find sympathetic division neurons, or the neuron cell bodies of those preganglionic neurons, is going to be in the spinal cord, and you're going to find the axons in the spinal nerves. Okay, so starting at about T1 down to L3, the nerves T1 to L3 are going to contain not only somatic motor neurons and sensory neurons and things like that, it's also going to contain these preganglionic neurons. And so what they're showing in this picture, what you want to pay attention to, is kind of how they represent this. The little dot represents the cell body and dendrites, and that would be in the lateral gray horns of the spinal cord, specifically in this region. Okay, so not above or below, but just specifically in that region is where you're going to find those neurons of the lateral gray horns. And the preganglionic fibers exit through the anterior nerve root, and they go a short distance to the ganglion. There is a chain of ganglia along the spinal cord, right next door. I'm going to show you a picture of this in a minute. But there's a chain of ganglia that run along. It's called the sympathetic ganglia, and that is where you have the preganglionic neurons synapsing with the postganglionic neurons. Preganglionic neurons are shown with a solid line. Remember, they're myelinated. Postganglionic neurons are shown with a dashed line. They're the ones that are unmyelinated. So this kind of goes along with that previous picture that showed dashed lines for those postganglionic fibers that were unmyelinated. This is where the synapse is happening, in the ganglia. Now, the ganglia are where the pre- and postganglionic neurons synapse above the diaphragm. Below the diaphragm, the nerve fiber runs through the ganglion and goes out to ganglia that are a little bit further out. We're not going to worry about that. These are still pretty close to the spinal cord. So the preganglionic neurons don't travel very far before they synapse with the postganglionic neurons. The postganglionic neurons, and there's the cell bodies where the synapses are happening. There they are in the ganglia here. This is where the synapse is. The postganglionic neurons, their fibers then run through nerves to the effector organs. Okay, these are all the effectors here. That's what the postganglionic neurons do. They stimulate the effectors. So the postganglionic nerve fibers typically are longer than the preganglionic fibers are. If you look at that picture, I'll come back to that in a minute. If you look at this picture, for example, notice the preganglionic fibers are short, postganglionic fibers are long, because the ganglion is close to the spinal cord. Whereas in the parasympathetic division, it's the opposite. Preganglionic neurons are longer, postganglionic neurons are shorter, typically. This picture shows one of those ganglia in that sympathetic chain of ganglia that run along the spinal cord. So right alongside the spinal cord, this close to it, is where you have this chain of ganglia. So in other words, the preganglionic neuron starts out here in the lateral gray horn. Its axon exits out this way, travels into the nerve, and down through these, what are called communicants. In other words, connectors that connect this nerve to the ganglion. So this is where the preganglionic neuron fibers would be. This is where the synapse would be between the pre and postganglionic neurons. This is above the diaphragm. Below the diaphragm, these fibers go out a little further to ganglia, a little bit further out, but not that much. And I'm not going to worry about that so much. These different ganglia, don't worry about the names of them or anything. It's just a little bit different in the below the diaphragm. And you might be thinking, well, why even have these ganglia here? Well, the reason being is that there's also nerve fibers running between the ganglia and synapsing, with other, with each other. The neurons are, sending signals to each other so that they're communicating, so that you get like because they're all communicating through that chain, that helps give you a faster sympathetic response because they're all communicating with each other through this chain of ganglia. But we're not going to worry about that too much. Just know that, you know, you've got this sympathetic chain, and, you know, that's primarily where the synapses are taking place between the pre and post ganglionic neurons. And that chain, like I said, is very close to the spinal cord. So those preganglionic fibers are not going to be all that long. Now you can see that the postganglionic fibers go out to different effectors. This is the sympathetic system. So what do you think it's going to do to your, here you can see it going up to the eyes, to the lacrimal glands, which are tear glands. Do you think it's going to stimulate production or inhibit production of tears? It actually inhibits tear production. It actually slows down tear production. In terms of salivary glands, those the parotids and submandibular and sublingual, those are salivary glands. What do you think it's going to do? You think it's going to stimulate secretion of saliva or inhibit it if it's sympathetic? What do you think? How many people say it would stimulate? How many people say it would inhibit? Okay. Some of you are saying, no, I don't know. Well, it would actually inhibit salivary gland production. It would inhibit saliva. So you might notice that when you're nervous or frightened, you know, people get dry mouth when they're nervous. That's why. So if you're giving a speech or something, maybe you want to have a glass of water in case you get thirsty. If you get nervous, so you actually do get a drier mouth when your sympathetic division kicks in. And heart. What do you think it's going to do to your heart rate? It's going to stimulate your heart rate. So it's going to stimulate cardiac muscle to beat faster and harder. It's going to open up your bronchial tubes. It's going to dilate bronchial tubes so that you can get more air to your lungs, so that you can get more oxygen to your cells and respond to an emergency or respond to exercise. You're going to also have an increase in respiratory rate. So the muscles involved in respiration, your diaphragm muscles and muscles in your chest, are going to increase their rate of respiration, in other words, or ventilation. So you're going to have faster and harder breathing. You're going to raise your chest up more than you normally would, you know, when you're breathing hard and things like that. And then down here in the abdominopelvic cavity, you're going to suppress digestive functions. You're going to reduce digestive functions. We're not going to get into kidney function because we'll get into that when we get to the kidneys themselves, but, or maybe, I don't know if we'll even talk about it in terms of sympathetic activity, but digestive function does increase. You know, there's an increased production of digestive juices. There's an increased activity of smooth muscles, so you get more peristaltic contractions and other contractions during digestion. The sympathetic division actually suppresses urination, and we'll talk about some of the effects it has on sex organs in a minute, but it does suppress, usually suppresses urination or going to the bathroom. Now, what about here showing the skin? What do you think it does to your sweat glands? It stimulates sweat glands, yes. It also, so it stimulates sweating. It also stimulates the erector pili muscle, which is smooth muscle in your skin that causes goosebumps. So sometimes you end up with goosebumps, like when you're scared, you might have goosebumps. It also constricts the blood vessels in your skin so that you're sending more more blood to your muscles so that you can increase muscular activity. This may, if you're not exercising, if you're just, you know, standing there and you're frightened or scared or stressed, you might feel that your skin is cold, and it might also be clammy because it's producing sweat at the same time. That gives you that cold and clammy feel when you're frightened. That's kind of an extreme of sympathetic activity when you're frightened, but that does sometimes happen. Now, of course, if you're exercising, you're producing so much heat, you're not going to notice that that's happening. But certainly, if you're frightened, you might notice cold and clammy skin. Oh, another thing I forgot to mention with the eyes, I talked about tear production, but also in terms of your eyes themselves, you'll see that when somebody's sympathetic division is kicked in, their eyes will actually will dilate, the pupil will get bigger, What this does is it helps with far off vision, because oftentimes you're having to run, like if you're running away from a lion or something like that, it's going to kill you. You need far off vision for that, and dilated eyes help you with that. So if you look at a cat when it's angry and upset, what does it do? Dilates its eyes. That's one sign that a cat is upset, right? You see its eyes are dilated. It might have its back humped up and its fur on end. Its fur on end is due to the contraction of the erector pili muscle and its fur, so it's causing its hair to go on end. And when you see a cat like that, you don't want to mess with it. It's going to scratch you, right? So it's trying to deal with an emergency. It's either going to fight or flee an emergency situation. It's upset. So you see that, some of those effects in an animal like a cat. So that's one different way of thinking about it. Let's see what else we have about the sympathetic division. Here's what I was talking about in terms of the adrenal glands. I'm going to have this picture. So here you can see where the adrenal glands are. Here's the kidneys. And this is about waist level, or maybe a little higher, up against your back body wall. And then on top of the kidneys are the adrenal glands. If you cut open the adrenal glands, it's that deeper section of the adrenal glands we call the adrenal medulla, which is producing epinephrine and norepinephrine in response to sympathetic stimulation by those preganglionic neurons that I was talking about. So that's what I was showing you. Let's see, like right here, you can see that preganglionic neuron going to the adrenal medulla. That's a picture there of the adrenal glands that contain the adrenal medulla. Okay. Now, sympathetic responses, you have these sympathetic responses in situations that begin with E. That's why it's called E situations, like exercise, emergency, excitement, and embarrassment. Those all activate to varying degrees a sympathetic response. But it does, there's all sorts of situations, being under pressure, being upset, being stressed, all of those can elicit the fight or flight response. So as I mentioned, you get stimulation of the adrenal glands, and that helps in that stimulation of those responses as well. You get an increase in heart rate and force of contraction. As a result, you also end up with an increase in blood pressure during that time. So you may notice that when your sympathetic activity is up, so is your blood pressure, which means you don't want to have your blood pressure taken, when that is happening. Some people get nervous at the doctor's office and they end up with, their blood pressure being a little elevated at the doctor's office as a result of that. Like I said, dilation of pupils, increased respiration rate, and dilation of the bronchial tubes, getting more air in and out of your lungs. There's going to be some, depending on the blood vessels, you're going to get vasodilation of blood vessels, meaning blood vessels are going to get enlarged, letting more blood flow to your skeletal muscle. You're also going to get vasodilation of blood vessels to your cardiac muscle and your heart, providing more oxygen to your to those muscles. But you're going to also get vasoconstriction of blood vessels to your skin, reducing blood flow to your skin, resulting in cooler skin temperature. Increased production of ATP energy. So there's a lot of things going on that affect metabolism. You're going to see in the liver an increase in glycogen breakdown. Glycogen is a complex carbohydrate. When you break it down, you get glucose. Glucose goes out into your bloodstream. You get more glucose, supplying energy to your muscles so you can respond to an emergency and respond to exercise. So you're going to see an increase in glucose levels that helps you produce ATP. Increase in lipid breakdown as well. So this is one reason why exercise can, of course, cause you to break down more fat, because it's being stimulated to break down fat to provide energy to your body. Talked about already stimulation of sweat glands, vasoconstriction of blood vessels to the skin, and erector pili muscle causing goosebumps. We already talked about all that. There's also going to be vasoconstriction of blood vessels to the digestive tract, which reduces blood flow to those organs in the digestive tract. I've made a few changes in these notes, by the way, so I've taken out any references to the urinary tract because it's a bit more complex in the urinary system, but so when you look at the notes, it may be a little different. So I'm going to be reposting the notes with any changes I've made. You do see an increase in digestive activities, and that means increases in, inhibiting, think of the other system, inhibiting digestive activities, which means inhibition of digestive glands like your salivary glands, inhibition of smooth muscles, so there's not as much muscular contraction going on in digestion, so your stomach's not going to churn, and you're not going to have so much peristaltic contractions and things like that. So notice that all of these, when we talk about these effectors, it's either heart muscle, cardiac muscle, in other words, smooth muscle, or glands that are being affected. And in this case, some of them are being stimulated, some are being inhibited. It depends on the location, though. Parasympathetic division. Any questions about sympathetic? Okay. So parasympathetic. Its nerves primarily, neurons are primarily in cranial nerves. And if you look at those cranial nerves that I posted in the nervous system review, you'll see certain nerves do have autonomic functions, and those autonomic functions are parasympathetic functions. So cranial nerves, and these are the numbers, 3, 7, 9, and 10, which are the oculomotor, facial, glossopharyngeal, and vagus. And the one you hear the most about is the vagus nerve because it has the most effects in the body. So you might notice that is, I'm going to close this door now. That's the one that has the biggest, the most effects, and seems to be the one you hear the most about in terms of parasympathetic activity. Now there are also some neurons coming out way down here in the sacral region of the spinal cord. None of them coming out here where the sympathetic nerves are, okay? But there are some sacral spinal nerves that provide innervation to the kidneys, urinary bladder, and sex organs, as well as some digestive organs. Now, the preganglionic neurons, which travel on these cranial and spinal nerves, they synapse with the postganglionic neurons in ganglia that are closer to the effector organs, that are further out from the spinal cord or brain and closer to the effector organs. So when they show a gray circle or bluish gray circle here, that is a ganglion. Notice that in the cranial nerves, there are these ganglia here. They have different names. Don't worry about the different ganglion names. But notice that in some cases, they don't show a ganglion. And that's because the ganglia are actually in the wall of these organs. That's how far out those neurons go. They go all the way out to the effector organ, and the ganglion is actually in the wall of the organ. And then you have very long preganglionic fibers and very short postganglionic fibers. The ganglionic fibers tend to be shorter, which if you look at that picture I showed you before, hopefully that's on the next slide, preganglionic fibers in the parasympathetic division are typically longer because they travel further out to ganglia that are either further out or actually in the wall of the organ. The postganglionic fibers, in some cases, can be very short, maybe just a few millimeters or centimeters long. They're not going to be very long in some cases. So you've got innervation. You can see the top one, cranial nerve number 3, going out to the eye. Notice oculomotor. Not only does this control eye movements, but it also controls other things in the face that you can read about in that cranial nerve section. You can see cranial nerve, the facial nerve going out to the face as well. Most of these neurons, except for vagus, most of these cranial nerves go to the face, stimulating tear production. Stimulating, in the case of the oculomotor nerve, it also stimulates constriction of the eye. Now, the sympathetic division stimulates dilation of the pupil of the eye. The parasympathetic division has the opposite effect. It constricts the eye so that you can deal with up-close activities like preparing food or reading a book, sewing, doing something up close, so close-up work. So the parasympathetic division actually constricts your pupils so you can see close-up better, because you're doing usually people who are, when you're resting and digesting, you're typically doing close-up work, not so much far-off distance vision. Saliva production is going to be increased. Tear production is going to be increased. by the parasympathetic division. The vagus nerve, you can see, goes to the heart. It actually slows the heart rate down. It has the effect of slowing down the heart rate. This nerve also goes to the respiratory system, where it slows down respiratory rate and constricts the bronchioles, so that just for normal breathing. You don't need dilated bronchioles. It's just normal dilation. The vagus also goes to digestive organs and stimulates the liver and stimulates the digestive organs for digestion. So your digestive function is stimulated by the vagus nerve. There are some people who have some kind of nerve problem where whenever they digest food, their heart rate slows down too much and they pass out. You may know somebody who's got that condition where they get, when they get an increase in vagus nerve activity, and they're increasing, they're digesting a meal, so there's more vagus nerve activity at that time. It also is suppressing the heart rate too much, causing the heart rate to slow down too much and your blood pressure to drop too much, and sometimes people pass out. And this is a abnormality in that vagus nerve. It does occasionally happen. And like I said, these, the spinal nerves are primarily innervating the digestive system and also providing urinary function and reproductive function. And urinary function, what's going to do is stimulate urination, when you go to the bathroom. We'll talk about reproductive organs as well in just a moment. So again, this is parasympathetic division at the bottom. And here's the effector organs. Same effector organs, but opposite effects. They have opposite effects from each other. Okay, so this is just talking about what I just talked about. Any questions so far about parasympathetic functions? Before we go on to the next thing. Okay, we're going to come back to the neurotransmitters in a minute, but let's look at parasympathetic responses. As I mentioned, it's called the rest and digest system. It's also called the feed and breathe system because it stimulates not only actions of digestion, but what can follow a meal, which might be breeding. You might have a meal and then have sex afterwards. But what it does is it stimulates sexual activity. So we'll see that in just a minute. So it's also called the feed and breed system. And so what it does is it conserves energy, it restores energy to the body, and it allows for increase in reproduction. So it increases digestive function, it increases urination, decreases blood flow to the skin. So your skin will be warm to the touch instead of cold and clammy. It's also going to decrease sweating, so you're not going to have clammy skin. You'll just have nice, dry, warm skin. Decreases heart rate, decreases respiratory rate, and the diameter of the airways for normal, quiet breathing, and it constricts the pupils for near vision, as I mentioned. Now, in terms of the role in sexual activity, the parasympathetic division in men stimulates erections. That's the parasympathetic division. Now, the parasympathetic division does most of the stimulation of the reproductive system, except for one thing, and that's ejaculation. The sympathetic division actually stimulates that, though there's some overlaying of functions. But sympathetic division stimulates ejaculation. Parasympathetic stimulates erections. In women, the parasympathetic division, excuse me, increases vaginal secretions during sex. Excuse me. Tickle my throat. It also stimulates the peristaltic contractions in the fallopian tubes. Fallopian tubes are where the egg is fertilized. When the fallopian tubes are contracting, they're sending that egg closer to the uterus for implantation. You need a cough drop, I think. Anyway. Yeah. What's that? Oh, thank you. Should have brought some with me, thanks.
I got more if you need them.
I'm gonna have to keep a bag of them up here because this time of year it's just so dry. It kills me. Okay. All right. Then we'll be talking about these, this more when we get to reproduction, but that's what they do. So, neurotransmitters, as I mentioned, it's the wrong direction. There's two neurotransmitters, acetylcholine So when you see ACH, you know that's what they're referring to. Norepinephrine, which is abbreviated NE. Remember, norepinephrine, which is also called noradrenaline, but it's both a hormone when it's released by the adrenal glands, but it's also a neurotransmitter. Either way, it's a chemical signal. You know, any kind of hormone or neurotransmitter is essentially a chemical messenger, sending a message to another cell. In the neurotransmitter form, it's sending a signal to whatever postganglionic, postsynaptic neuron is being stimulated. Whereas hormones are released into the bloodstream, travel through the blood, and affect target cells that way. That's how hormones work. But we're focusing mainly on the neurotransmitter side of this. So there are two types of neurons. Cholinergic, meaning acetylcholine. Cholinergic means they are secreting acetylcholine. So if you think choline, cholinergic at synapses. Adrenergic neurons secrete norepinephrine. The adrenal glands produce adrenaline and noradrenaline. That's a way to remember that, because noradrenaline is the same thing as norepinephrine. So it's a little confusing, but adrenergic neurons do secrete norepinephrine at the synapses. Now, that being said, most of the neurons are going to be cholinergic, okay, as we'll see, which helps at least in terms of guessing for a right answer. The somatic nervous system, those somatic motor neurons are always cholinergic. They always secrete acetylcholine, which stimulates muscle contraction, always. So that's the somatic system there at the top. In the autonomic system, wherever you see acetylcholine, that means that's a cholinergic neuron. So this would be a cholinergic neuron here. That's cholinergic, and that's cholinergic. So just about all of these are cholinergic with one exception, and that's this one. The sympathetic postganglionic neurons are adrenergic. So we're going to look at cholinergic versus adrenergic. And as I said, cholinergic secretes acetylcholine. This is just showing you in the autonomic nervous system. So again, wherever you see acetylcholine, and what they're showing here, if you look closely, these are multipolar neurons. This is the cell body and dendrites. This is the preganglionic neuron axon. Notice it's myelinated. All of these are myelinated. The blues are sympathetic. The red is parasympathetic. And then here would be the ganglia, where there's a synapse between the synaptic end bulbs. These are axon terminals they're showing, but the synaptic end bulbs between the preganglionic neuron and the dendrites and cell body of the postganglionic neuron. So in other words, at this synapse, you've got acetylcholine being released, and you have acetylcholine receptors on that postganglionic membrane there. And then here you have acetylcholine shown as red dots being released here. And then this is the postganglionic neuron. It's got receptors for acetylcholine. Same way here. Acetylcholine receptors here because acetylcholine is being released. Notice the postganglionic nerve fiber is unmyelinated. And then it shows here the synapse here with the effector organs or the effector cells. And if there's acetylcholine being released, then there's going to be acetylcholine receptors on the effector cell. Whether it's a smooth muscle cell or gland cell or cardiac muscle cell, it's going to have those acetylcholine receptors. So here you see acetylcholine being released here by this sympathetic postganglionic neuron. It's cholinergic. You're going to have acetylcholine receptors on this cell. And so, like I said, if you break it down, all of the preganglionic neurons, whether it's sympathetic or parasympathetic, all of the preganglionic neurons are cholinergic. And the parasympathetic postganglionic neurons are cholinergic. And If you look at the sympathetic division, it's different. Those are adrenergic. These neurons are releasing norepinephrine, so they're adrenergic neurons, and that means there's norepinephrine receptors on the effector cell instead of acetylcholine receptors at that synapse. You can see most of the neurons are cholinergic, okay? So we're going to look at that. Cholinergic neurons include all somatic motor neurons, all sympathetic preganglionic neurons, all parasympathetic preganglionic neurons, and postganglionic neurons, okay? Those are all cholinergic. They all release acetylcholine. So what I've got in the squares, all cholinergic, okay? Same thing here. Now, one thing that's a little weird, and I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but notice that most sympathetic postganglionic neurons are adrenergic. They're releasing norepinephrine. So they're the exception to the acetylcholine rule. With one exception, that is this one. The postganglionic neurons in the sympathetic system that stimulate your sweat glands, they are cholinergic. So when they release acetylcholine, that stimulates sweat production. That is the one exception, in terms of this postganglionic neurons. That's one place you see acetylcholine production. Most postganglionic neurons are adrenergic and produce norepinephrine. Now, I've mentioned receptors. We have receptors for neurotransmitters at these synapses. In order for those neurotransmitters to work, they have to bind to a receptor. Remember, they have to open up either a sodium channel or chloride ion channel and allow for the inflow of sodium or chloride ions to either depolarize or hyperpolarize the effector cell membrane. So anywhere you've got a synapse, not only do you have neurotransmitters released, you've also got receptors, but not all receptors are alike. Some of the receptors for acetylcholine are what we call nicotinic receptors. Some are called muscarinic receptors. Okay? This is only for acetylcholine. Nicotinic or muscarinic. Nicotinic is named for nicotine. Muscarinic is named for the mushroom poison muscarine. Okay, so nicotinic receptors. Nicotine, which you find in cigarettes, can also bind to these receptors and can mimic the effects of acetylcholine. So it can kind of bring on some of these same effects that acetylcholine brings on. So nicotinic receptors are named for nicotine for that reason, that nicotine can bind to these same receptors. Nicotinic receptors for acetylcholine are found on the dendrites and cell bodies of all postganglionic neurons in the sympathetic and parasympathetic division. In other words, where's my pictures here? Okay. So what they're talking about is here and here. These receptors are nicotinic receptors on the postganglionic neurons here. Nicotinic, nicotinic, nicotinic. All of those are nicotinic receptors. The adrenal gland cells that secrete adrenaline and norepinephrine, those cells have nicotinic receptors. I'm not sure if it shows you that in this picture or not. No, it doesn't. But where's that one picture? Okay. These cells, in other words, are going to be nicotinic, have nicotinic receptors. When they're stimulated by acetylcholine, those acetylcholine is going to bind to those nicotinic receptors. And also the motor end plates at neuromuscular junctions. For that picture, you have to go back to this one too. In other words, skeletal muscle cells, those receptors that bind to acetylcholine, those are also nicotinic receptors. Now we're focusing on the autonomic system, but those are nicotinic. So I put a square, at least in this picture, you can see a square on all of those. Notice that the nicotinic receptors in the autonomic system are primarily, you're looking at the dendrites and cell body of the postganglionic neuron. That's where you're seeing it. Notice that even though there's acetylcholine being released here, that is a muscarinic receptor. And here's acetylcholine here too, and that's muscarinic. So these are different receptors right here. All right, so all these places, I think where I've got, well, not all of these places. I think I just threw that picture in to show you the somatic nervous system. Okay, now the other type of acetylcholine receptor is muscarinic, and this is where muscarine has its effects. A mushroom poison that, if you eat a poisonous mushroom, you could be eating this muscarine poison. It binds to the muscarinic receptors that normally acetylcholine can bind to. So, one thing you want to keep in mind is that receptors normally bind to only one thing, but there are poisons and toxins and also medications that we take. The pharmaceutical industry oftentimes makes medications that, where there's a binding to a receptor, where a medicine binds to a receptor. Or illegal drugs, that's how they have an effect. They bind to receptors that bring on the effects of things like endorphins and things like that, which is why it's so addictive when you take heroin or something like that. So some medications we take illegally and legally can bind to receptors. But muscarine isn't a medication, it's a poison. It binds to, or acetylcholine binds to these receptors, which are located on the plasma membrane of effectors in the parasympathetic division. In other words, anywhere that you see the postganglionic parasympathetic neurons stimulating effectors, they are going to be muscarinic receptors. And then also, oddly enough, the sweat glands, remember these are being stimulated by acetylcholine as well, they also have muscarinic effectors, or muscarinic receptors. So what muscarine does is it brings on extreme versions of parasympathetic effects. It slows down your heart rate and can slow it down to where it stops. Slows down or suppresses respiration. It also does things like stimulate salivary glands and tears, so you might tear up more and you might produce more saliva. You might just get real foamy at the mouth from taking muscarine. And because those sweat glands also have muscarinic receptors, you increase your sweat production, so you get sweaty. You get sweaty, foaming at the mouth, tear production, excess tear production, and slowing down of the heart. And it's the slowing down of the heart and respiratory rate that's can be lethal. So here you can see where the muscarinic receptors are. Primarily what we're focused on is this one, which is the parasympathetic, what the parasympathetic postganglionic neurons are stimulating. They're releasing acetylcholine. That acetylcholine is binding to muscarinic receptors on the effector cells. So remember, this is the parasympathetic division. It is doing things like slowing down heart rate. So if this effector cell is cardiac muscle, it's going to have muscarinic receptors. If this is smooth muscle, it's going to be muscarinic receptors. If it's the salivary glands and tear glands, those are muscarinic receptors. So anything the parasympathetic division stimulates are muscarinic. So if this were a tear gland cell, it would start producing more tears. If it was a salivary gland cell, it would produce more saliva. If it was a smooth muscle in your digestive tract, it'll start contracting more. But notice too, even though it's acetylcholine, if it's cardiac muscle, it's slowing it down. Notice that acetylcholine can be stimulatory here, but if you look at skeletal muscle, it's inhibitory here. Inhibitory here, but in skeletal muscle, it stimulates. So acetylcholine inhibits the cardiac muscle or heart, slows it down, but in the somatic nervous system, it stimulates skeletal muscle and stimulates contraction. But again, skeletal muscle has a different kind of receptor. So in those receptors, you're opening up sodium ion channels, letting in sodium ions that depolarize the membrane, bringing on action potentials in the muscle that generate contraction. On the other hand, in the heart, you're opening up chloride ion channels, and you're hyperpolarizing the heart, inhibiting contraction, okay? So the effect here in the heart would be inhibitory. And these muscarinic receptors, again, if you think muscarine slows down the heart, That's how one way of remembering that. The muscarinic receptors are located there. Again, muscarinic receptors are in sweat glands, even though this is the sympathetic system here. This is the one place where you see sympathetic postganglionic neurons releasing acetylcholine, which stimulates sweat production, and therefore you sweat more if, like I said, if you have muscarine poisoning. But the normal functioning, of course, is that you sweat when the sympathetic division is kicking in. That's normal functioning. Now, so here's giving you some ideas of muscarine poisoning symptoms. You can see that all of this, you're just activating these muscarinic receptors, primarily in the parasympathetic division, except for the sweating. So you see facial flushing or dilation of blood vessels in the face, increased salivation and tears, also you start getting smooth muscle contractions in the digestive tract, and that can lead to vomiting and abdominal cramps, increase in diarrhea, urination, excessive constriction of the pupil of the eye, so it becomes excessively constricted because parasympathetic constricts the eye. Muscarine can cause overconstriction of the eye. Bradycardia, which is low heart rate, hypotension, which is low blood pressure from that low heart rate, and dizziness because of that hypotension. Okay, the other, yes?
If you're on a simple constricted, you could just like not see.
You could probably still, I don't know how much. If it's like to a pinpoint, probably not. I don't know how constricted it gets. I'd have to look into it. But if it were constricted too much, yeah, you wouldn't be able to see. It's just more than normal. I think it's just one of those symptoms that you can see when somebody has muscarine poisoning, their eyes are really excessively constricted. But whether it's constricted to a point where they can't see very well is, I don't know. I'd have to look into that because I'm not sure. But it would definitely affect the vision, I'm sure, because you're not letting much light into the eye. Let's see where we are. Okay. So adrenergic neurons. So everything so far has been cholinergic. Now we're going to look very quickly at adrenergic neurons. And these are the ones that release norepinephrine. Again, norepinephrine is also called noradrenaline. If you remember that adrenal glands produce adrenaline, and noradrenaline or norepinephrine, that's one way of remembering adrenergic, as in adrenal. But here we're not talking about adrenal glands, we're talking about the sympathetic nervous system. But remember that adrenal glands and sympathetic division have the same effects. Most sympathetic postganglionic neurons, with the exception of those that stimulate the sweat glands, every other one is adrenergic. It's releasing noradrenaline, which makes sense. It's bringing on a sympathetic response, so that makes sense, right? Because adrenal glands also produce norepinephrine. And so this is the only place you're going to see norepinephrine released. The only neurons that are adrenergic are these postganglionic sympathetic neurons. There's NE for norepinephrine. So these effector cells at those synapses are going to have norepinephrine receptors. So in other words, pretty much every tissue in the body, except for your skeletal muscle, but in terms of glands, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle, they all have some synapses with receptors for norepinephrine, and they also have synapses with other neurons where you have acetylcholine receptors or muscarinic receptors. So keep in mind that these cells have innervation from both postganglionic neurons or postganglionic parasympathetic neurons and postganglionic sympathetic neurons. At the sympathetic synapses, there's norepinephrine receptors. At the parasympathetic synapses, there's acetylcholine muscarinic receptors. So you can have, like, say this surface here is a dendrite of one postganglionic neuron, and say these fingertips, this is the sympathetic postganglionic nerve synaptic end bulbs. So here's those synapses. So these are releasing, if these are sympathetic, they're releasing norepinephrine. So you've got norepinephrine receptors here, and then over here, these synaptic end bulbs are synapsing with the postganglionic neuron a different location. At these locations, you're gonna have, those muscarinic adrenergic receptors. So different receptors at the different synapses, okay? Different neurons releasing different neurotransmitters, different receptors at those synapses. So there's the one place where you're gonna have norepinephrine produced. This is sympathetic, and this is the postganglionic neuron, norepinephrine being released, and norepinephrine receptors. The receptors for norepinephrine are either alpha or beta receptors. Alpha 1 and beta 1 receptors usually produce excitation in the effector cell. In other words, stimulating cardiac muscle to contract, stimulating smooth muscle to contract, stimulating a gland to secrete something, okay? Those are alpha 1 and beta 1. Alpha 2 and beta 2 receptors, they're just two different types of receptors. They're called alpha, they just have different names. But the ones with the number 2 next to them, the alpha 2 and beta 2 receptors, different proteins, but they have the same effect. They cause inhibition of the effector cell. So they would inhibit smooth muscle contractions. They would inhibit certain glandular secretions like tears and saliva and digestive glands and things like that. So it just depends on, the location. You're going to have different kinds of receptors. The heart has beta 1 receptors in it. So it's, you're stimulating the heart. Smooth muscle in the digestive system is going to have either alpha 2 or beta 2 receptors. Now you might know about beta blockers. You may know somebody who's taking beta blockers. They block these beta 1 receptors and prevent the binding of norepinephrine to the receptor, which means, they're not going to allow acetylcholine to bind as well to those receptors, and that helps slow down heart rate and things like that. So depending on what you're trying to do, what you're treating for, if you're using beta 1 or beta blockers, you're blocking beta receptors. They're usually like beta 1, but I suppose even beta 2 maybe. I don't know what kind of medications would do that, but maybe there's some that block beta 2 receptors. But you're blocking those receptors. Not only, it's like, so if you're taking it for your heart, if you've got high blood pressure or heart problems, and you're taking beta blockers, that's not only going to slow down your heart rate, which is treating the problem, but you're also going to block other beta 1 receptors, which means you can end up with symptoms as a result. You end up with, or side effects, I should say, not symptoms. But some of the side effects of taking beta blockers are due to the fact you're not just blocking the ones you want to block, but you're also blocking ones you're not really trying to block. And that can bring on other symptoms that people might have as a result of taking beta blockers. So oftentimes side effects happen if you're using some kind of medication that works on a receptor level. The symptoms happen because you affect not just the receptors you want to affect, but you're also affecting other receptors as well. Okay, so it's 10:41. I've got a few more minutes, but to finish this up. But this is just showing you where those. This is where those alpha 1 and 2 and the beta 1 and 2 receptors are at those synapses specifically. Now, what I want to point out too is that, okay, if it's an alpha 1 or beta 1 receptor, and that means it's stimulatory, what alpha 1 and beta 1 receptors do is they bring on, they open up and let sodium or calcium ions in. That's going to depolarize the membrane and possibly depolarize it to threshold, generating excitatory postsynaptic potentials, which then in effect bring on the effect on that cell, causing it to either contract if it's muscle or secrete if it's a gland, okay? But if it's an alpha 2 or beta 2 receptor, those alpha 2 and beta 2 receptors, when they open up, they let in chloride ions, which hyperpolarize the membrane. That's going to bring it away from threshold for that effector cell. That's going to suppress the formation of action potentials in that receptor cell, that effector cell, and that means that smooth muscle or glandular cell is going to not be active. In other words, smooth muscle will relax and glands would not secrete. So if you're trying to inhibit something, that's what you're doing is that. You're opening up those alpha-2 and beta-2 receptors to generate hyperpolarizing postsynaptic potentials, which are inhibitory postsynaptic potentials. Now these potentials are happening in the effector cell. Effector cells can generate postsynaptic potentials just like a neuron can, because they have resting membrane potentials themselves. They are able to be stimulated or inhibited by either generating this and stimulating them, or generating this and inhibiting them in their membranes. And from then on, at that point, at least in this case, if it's going to be a muscle cell, it's going to contract, or if it's a glandular cell, it's going to produce something in response. This picture, this is just a table. You've got one similar in your book, in your textbook, that shows side-by-side comparisons, and this is a helpful comparison to see what effects are sympathetic effects, like dilation of the pupil versus constriction of the pupil in the parasympathetic system. Here's parasympathetic division. So it's showing the effects. In some cases, there's no known effect. So there's a slash there. It means if there is an effect, we don't know what it is. So in some cases, there is not an effect. But in most cases, you can see there are opposite effects. One stimulates, the other inhibits. Depends on the situation. And I think that's it. So we will stop there. We'll pick up on